So hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jonathan Pattenberg. This is the third in our webinar series around a slate of different topics and presentations in lieu of the what would usually be on-site presentations. What I first wanted to do is either turn it over to Corey or Laura to see if there was anything that they wanted to add or say to kick things off, and then I will jump back in to get things moving.
Well, this is Laura, and I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. This is part of a series, and so we will have one monthly for December, January, February, and in March. And so I'll be sure and send out connection information for each of those meetings. If you have questions, please feel free to, either share them, it's a small group, or put them in the chat, and I can help Jonathan watch the chat. But again, thank you for joining us. And Jonathan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. So again, thank you everybody for attending. Today, what we're really going to focus on is a performance improvement program. The purpose of the presentation today is really to look at different opportunities around trying to merge finance and quality and really coming up with an overall performance improvement program. Now, we are also recording this presentation, so if you have to jump off or if those aren't able to attend, the presentation will be circulated at a later date. So you will be able to get that information and to watch this later. Now, the purpose of today is really to cover different concepts at a higher level. I realize that when we look to change things such as revenue cycle or quality improvement, there's a number of different ways that we can go. So the purpose of today is really to discuss different concepts around performance improvement, specifically around finance and quality. What we're seeing is that organizations that have continued to look at merging quality and finance and really looking at it as a combined approach to performance improvement have continued to see gains going forward when compared to other hospitals that continue to create or operate within a siloed environment. And really what we're finding is that quality has a direct impact on financial performance, and the financial performance of an organization has a direct impact on either the services we can provide or the additional services that we can offer, whether it's care management, whether it's certain things with regard to that, whether it's clinical workers or whatever from that perspective. So again, as we continue to look at going forward, it's continuing to merge those two components as we continue to move forward within an organization. So what really is the goal for performance improvement? And really what it is it's integrating a number of key components, whether it's data, whether it's leveraging that information, whether it's financial outcomes, whether it's benchmarking, whether it's quality improvement. It's integrating all of those different reporting and compliance functions across your entire hospital and coming up with a true system-based approach to really move the needle for an organization as a whole. Again, it's removing those silos, it's removing those redundancies that we often see within organizations. And again, it's coming up as a broad approach to improving the financial performance and the quality performance of an organization. Now, when we often deal with smaller community-sized hospitals, particularly critical access hospitals, individuals often wear multiple hats. So maybe on Tuesdays, you're the CFO, on Wednesdays, you're the controller, on Thursdays, you're actually doing coding and billing, you're on the compliance committee, you're doing all of these different functions. So it's more important than often seen in larger sized organizations in truly establishing and creating efficiencies across the organization. Because for a smaller organization, the most valuable thing that we have is really our time. And the ability to get things done quickly and efficiently is what allows us to focus on things across the broader organization. So again, we don't want to become highly focused on specific things. We want to ensure that we're able to move the needle as a whole. So first, what we're going to talk about is some background regarding performance improvement and really lay the foundation of that different information. Now, when we think about strategic risk for an organization, and again, I identified 4 specific areas, but they could be renamed different things. For the purposes of the conversation, when we're looking at strategic risk, we really got to focus on our financial risk, operating, market, and value. And the goal of performance improvement is to continue to evaluate each of these 4 tangible areas and continue to make improvement to mitigate our risk as an organization. Now, what ends up happening is if we don't end up mitigating our risk, we end up getting stuck in an environment where we have worsening financial performance, worsening outcomes. Maybe we see a decline in volume. Maybe we see a decline in financial performance or margin. But what it's realizing is the interrelation of each of those different components that they have on one another. And ultimately, it is a cycle or a circle approach to realize the direct relationship between each of those different components. So what ends up happening is if we focus too much on financial improvement, we may end up worsening our value position or lose market share or lose efficiencies within the operating realm. When we think of clinical service delivery, we really consider that within the value and the operating, even though it's not clearly defined. So again, it's realizing the interrelation and focusing across the board on those different areas and really looking at how we can mitigate management responses and really work forward to improve overall performance. As we break out the different components within that area, it's really looking at how we're going to categorize each of those components. Somebody, if you could put your phone on mute, there's some ruffling in the background. As we look at those different categorical areas, again, it's looking at things like staffing components, payer contracts, growth opportunities, performance, revenue cycle, all of those different components. What we want to do is continue to realize those importance and continue to come up with efforts to improve those different areas. So what really are the 5 areas or 5 characteristics of an improvement plan? Now, HRSA came out and actually developed or quantified the 5 different characteristics of an improvement plan. And what they really said is it's a systematic process or approach. I'm going to try and mute everybody. Kay, I think it's actually your phone that's making a lot of noise. Okay, muted everybody, so hopefully y'all can still hear me. So when we look at those 5 different characteristics, it's looking at the different factors that end up driving performance going forward. So again, it's leveraging all available data. It's focusing on the linkages. It's process improvement. It's actually data collection. And what it's realizing is as we've continued to grow as hospitals and organizations, the availability of data is paramount to continued financial and operational performance improvement going forward. As we've continued to look at that data, that is our most valuable resource. Oftentimes what ends up going on is we'll go into an organization and talk about different ways to improve their performance. And they're not leveraging their most valuable resource as an organization, which is that data itself. Oftentimes performance improvement is done in a vacuum or failure to actually look at those different components or areas. Now, I realize we have certain areas such as HCAHPS and core measures and different things to leverage those data points. But again, it's taking it a step further than those actual quantified things from a government perspective. What it's really looking at is leveraging a different data points and process improvement to really come up with ways to actually improve performance improvement across the organization. But again, it's combining the finance and the quality and working together to drive those performance improvement initiatives instead of focusing on a single point or a singular area of focus. What's interesting, as we've continued to look at these areas, we've actually seen where a revenue cycle committee and a quality improvement committee could actually be focusing on the same exact area from a quality improvement perspective, but actually have a different benchmark or a different goal within the organization. So maybe one had a, let's get physician documentation and clearance out to maybe 10 days, and the other one had set a 5 days. So because we're creating those silo events, it's creating conflicting benchmarks, but then also a duplication of efforts going forward. So again, it's a systematic process that includes really all of leadership, a full spectrum of accountability, and truly dedicating the resources within the organization, not just dedicating, but creating the efficiency of resources within an organization as you continue to move forward. Now, when we look at the different areas within an effective improvement program structure, there's countless different areas that we really want to include. We need to clarify the roles. We need to figure out what type of data we're going to pull. We need to figure out the reporting routines. We need to identify gaps and measures that actually need to be quantified. Again, it's a full evidence-based, system-based approach to how we're going to look at the organization going forward and how we're going to leverage that data from that perspective to actually drive that process improvement. Oftentimes what we see is organizations will end up taking an approach where they will carve out certain components. And it's not necessarily because they don't want to focus on that. It's oftentimes because they don't have the necessary expertise within a particular area to focus on something from a perspective of improvement. And we often see this with critical access hospitals where, due to specific gaps in expertise or experience, we often tend to focus on other areas as opposed to focusing on those areas due to that lack of experience or expertise. When we look at what actually influences program effectiveness, everything you can think of within the organization can really impact the effectiveness. The willingness of staff to participate, the financial resources available within an organization, the scope of services, the access to professional staff, the access to core relations or compliance departments or legal departments, the overall mission of our hospital. Again, anything that we can think about can really influence the program effectiveness as we continue to look at these as a go-forward basis. And again, as we continue to look at this as a perspective of improving things, we want to continue to mitigate things that are impacting or influencing our inabilities to actually move things forward and continue to combat those from a perspective of that overall performance improvement. So one would ask, how did we get to where we are today? And when we think about it, quality and finance have always been segmented if we continue to go through history of these two different areas. If we go back to the 80s and 90s, it was really broken out with quality insurance. And that was really the term of that time period of looking at quality insurance from that perspective. Revenue cycle committee continued to focus on revenue cycle initiatives. So your days not final billed, your days in AR, all of those different factors from a revenue cycle perspective. And finance really focused on budgeting and statement preparation. And what we've really seen over time is that through the segmenting of these operations, it's created an environment where often our finance department does not involve our quality leaders or our clinical care staff in the actual creation of budgets and statements and performance improvement and actual accountability from that perspective. And what it's doing is it's creating an environment where often there is a disconnect between the actual budgets and statements themselves and what the expectations are for staff to perform within those particular departments. When we get to the 90s, the term really moved towards quality improvement. But what ended up happening is again, we still had those three major segments within the industry. So now quality is quality improvement. We still had our revenue cycle committee, and then we had budgets and statements as a standalone. Around the time of 2000, quality went through another name change of really updating it to more performance improvement. And what ended up happening is on the finance side, we ended up seeing a merger of both revenue cycle and the finance side. And what we started to realize is that because revenue cycle with claims collections and coding and documentation and all of those different functions had a direct impact on the financial performance of hospitals and organizations, that we started to see a merger of those two distinct areas in the past. And that's really where we start to see the environment that we are in now, where we have that segmenting or separation between what is quality / performance improvement and really what is our revenue cycle / finance committee improvement. Now, as we've continued to push for a convergence of those two areas, what we're seeing in today's times is our highest performing organizations have broken down those silos, and they've really come together with an integrated quality and finance performance improvement initiative. And what they're realizing is because there are those direct linkages between finance and quality, again, where one impacts the other, they're coming up with strategic plans and approaches as to how to improve overall performance. What they're also realizing is that when we used to have those siloed situations, both of those different silos would maybe come up with 10 different plans of action or 10 different areas of focus. And then we create all of our sub areas of focus. So we would go into an organization and they would maybe have 20 plus different key factors that they wanted to focus on within a given year. And what ends up happening is that by creating such a large number of different performance areas, we were often not able to actually focus on all the areas as a collective. So again, we ended up overwhelming ourselves in certain areas from that perspective. And again, as we've continued to see those mergers, we've been able to create a better environment from an efficiency perspective and the ability to move forward from that. Now, when we look at the current structure, and again, that structure is both the siloing of finance and operations, what has really led to that environment and what is the current advantages? Now, I do want to be clear, there are current advantages and disadvantages in both of those environments. Some of the current advantages of having those separate silos is it's easier for staff to learn. When we have clinical staff only focused on clinical functions, not having to learn financial functions, and same thing, finance staff only focused on financial outcomes and not having to worry about the financial ramifications of certain decisions, it allows us to operate in an environment where certain individuals can get more granular within the areas that they're functioning. Again, not all staff need to focus on different areas. And it also allows us to focus on, as we talked about a moment ago, a larger number of metrics across the organization. But again, it's not to say that an increase in the number of metrics is actually better or more advantageous, but it does allow us to focus on certain things from that perspective where we can target more things and hopefully show improvement in certain areas. Now, when we look at the different disadvantages, I would say that there's a number of more disadvantages than there are advantages around the different segmenting of those two initiatives. It always reminds me when I look at the siloing of events is I once showed up to a meeting, we were having a department meeting, and we continue to have more than enough department meetings at the last hospital that I was operating at. And I actually showed up to this meeting with a ribbon on that said I survived another meeting that could have been an email. And what I came to realize after all of these different meetings is there is no abundance of meetings within smaller hospitals. But oftentimes what ends up happening is we end up creating a significant number of meetings, but we don't evaluate from the perspective of, do we need to continue to maintain these meetings going forward? Oftentimes what ends up happening is these meetings continue to become a part of our operating practice, and nobody wants to call or make the decision to end up terminating one of these meetings. So again, it remains a core function when it really doesn't have to remain a core function or a part of our hospital. And again, it continues to involve the same people over and over and over again. Also, what ends up happening is because we have those different silos, one thing I really want to emphasize on this is the variation within the hospital as to expectations. So the expectations for one individual could be drastically different than the expectations for another. And again, because we're approaching it from a siloing perspective and not looking at the linkages between the two different areas, the siloing creates an environment where the expectations of maybe senior leadership or the board is different than those actually implementing the processes within those two silos. So again, those variation can end up creating an environment where we're not performing at the level that maybe is requested of us or wanting to look at it from that perspective. The last area on this is really the lack of transparency. And when we think about the different siloing across the organization, when we don't involve all those individuals that end up having an impact or influence on those particular components, one, it leads to a lack of transparency where individuals do not know what's going on in those other departments. But oftentimes we end up seeing measures that are passed or implemented. And those measures from a performance improvement perspective don't even involve the direct staff that would be required to actually effectuate change within that area. So again, we'll often come up with a particular measure, but then really have no ability to drive or bring forth change relative to that measure because we're not pulling in the key individuals that actually are required to necessitate change. So what really are the building blocks around performance improvement, both revenue cycle and quality? Now, all of the different roles and responsibilities within an organization, everybody plays a key role in ultimate performance improvement, all the way down from governance, all the way to the individuals and committees that are actually performing certain steps or components. Now, when we look at the list up here, everywhere from board of directors, executive management team, PIEC, which is that new committee that we're going to talk about, all the way down. Now, this is not in sequential order. So it's not saying that the PIEC reports to MEC and so on. It's really just categorizing the different areas that are important relative from a performance improvement perspective for identification purposes and really stating what those different categorical areas provide relative to performance improvement as a whole. One thing I would say is that what is really important to driving this overall initiative is really the accountability across the organization. It's not only pulling in key individuals that are a part of the actual process, but it's important upon senior leaders, the board, and other department staff to actually hold each other accountable relative to performance improvement as a whole. So again, it's focusing on those different initiatives and ensuring that we continue to move forward from a performance improvement perspective. When we look at the different areas, we're still going to also have a group of management committees. So this PIEC is not saying to replace our board of directors or our executive management team or our medical executive committee. These committees and groups will still continue to meet. However, their role will more function to provide assistance to PIEC, but then also serve their core responsibilities as a whole. So again, for instance, our medical executive committee will review and evaluate clinical processes and outcomes. They'll ensure that we're establishing evidence-based outcomes and standards. It's driving all of those different functions so that PIEC has the appropriate framework from a regulatory and governance perspective and senior leadership perspective to really come up with an approach as to how to improve overall performance at the organization. So next, what we're going to look at is what is the Performance Improvement Executive Council, the PIEC. So what the PIEC is it's a collective of individuals across the organization. It's breaking down those silos and really looking at from the perspective of who are the critical individuals that drive change throughout an organization and ensuring that they come together to ultimately improve the organization as a whole. Now, when we look at the leadership of the PIEC, we generally say it should be a tandem team of your CFO and either a COO or a CNO, depending upon your organizational structure. Now, the reason why we say it's these two individuals is the two individuals that were listed, there are oftentimes no organization where at the critical access or community-sized hospital level where everybody ultimately at some point would report up to one of those two individuals. Now, the reason why we end up not identifying it as the CEO or the president of the hospital is because we want the president or CEO to be focused more on strategic direction and overall approach for the organization than actual process improvement, which is really more your day-to-day functionality within the organization. Now, when we look at who we want to include in this group, we want to include our revenue cycle directors, a board member, an ED director, a physician, or a provider. Again, we want to include those individuals that have a direct responsibility or direct influence over the ability to effectuate change throughout the major processes and systems within the organization. The purpose of the PIEC is to meet monthly, and again, to hold the different groups responsible and accountable, and also drive those different directional changes around performance improvement. So establishing the benchmarks, establishing the overall direction, and looking at it from those factors. So again, it's really that catch-all group that ends up categorizing, identifying, and grouping things together as you continue to move forward. Now, when we look within a hospital, all of the departments, every different department within a hospital is considered a reporting entity. And the purpose of these different reporting entities is to consolidate, collect, differentiate, and really take that information within their department and report that information to the PIEC. Again, looking at both our major and non-major areas, physician-driven versus non-provider-driven areas. And again, the purpose of the reporting entities is to leverage that data within the organization to use that to drive outcomes as we continue to go forward. Unfortunately, what we often see within smaller hospitals is many of our managers or department heads are so involved in the day-to-day delivery of care that they're unable to get focused on the different leadership functions from a performance and process improvement perspective. Now, I'm not saying that from a negative perspective for the hospitals. I'm really saying it from the perspective that oftentimes resources are limited, so people have to wear those different hats. What this allows us to do from a reporting entity perspective is realize that we do not need to be involved with every other department. It allows us to take a more granular approach on our own department and continue to roll that information upward to the PIEC so that that PIEC can leverage that data to then drive overall performance improvement and directional change. But again, it's taking it from the perspective of the merging of both finance and quality. Now, when we look at the different areas for opportunities for improvement, we need to evaluate the relative importance, the risk, the problems, the market impact. It's weighting it from all of these different perspectives, realizing that we may come up with 7 different areas that we want to focus on within a given year. What we need to realize is that as we continue to rank those 7 areas, there's a different level of importance of those different areas as we continue to evaluate from a performance improvement perspective. We cannot assume that every standard or every area is going to hold the same weight relative from an importance perspective. The failure, the inability to pass or improve on one metric can have a much worse impact on the organization than some of the other metrics that we continue to look at. So again, it's evaluating all of those different factors to ensure that we evaluate the importance so that when we continue to set those factors, we continue to do from a perspective of a ranking perspective from an importance to the overall expectation of the organization. Now, from a clinical perspective, and I realize that this is something that is often realized from a clinical area, is really the PICO approach. And what it focuses on is the population-problem situation, intervention, comparison, outcome, and time. And what it really looks at is, again, it's a different categorical way to focus on different things as an organization so we continue to drive those things going forward. Again, what we like to say is that we want to leverage different resources and different approaches for our organization. Maybe the SBAR approach works for one. Maybe SWOT analysis works for another one. Again, it's leveraging within the comfort level of your organization to realize the strategic importance of these different initiatives and then really working together to categorize them so we can continue to move forward and ultimately improve performance, which is the goal of our organization. The last one before I really get into really bringing it all together is this is the prioritization matrix. And as we were talking about a moment ago, this will help us actually categorize those different areas from a level of importance. And what it's looking at is it's basing these different parameters to really come up with that ranking system as we continue to look forward. And again, what it's realizing is that, and the categories on the left would change relative to what you are identifying as an organization. These are just some that were identified for purposes of the presentation. But as we categorize those different areas, it's coming together to say that we want to evaluate and prioritize those different areas so that we can continue to dedicate the appropriate resources as we move forward as an organization. So the last section we're going to focus on, and then what I'll do is I'll open it up to questions. And if there aren't any questions, then we'll just give people some back of their time today, is really bringing it all together. I know this is going to be rather small for everybody to see, but what I will do is I will send this out to Laura and she will circulate it to the group. This is actually printed out on a large 11 by 17 piece of paper. But what this shows is how really your performance improvement executive committee works, or council. And it shows all of the linkages between the different departments. And it talks about the importance of your task force development, your reporting entities, and all of those different subgroups, whether it's utilization management, plant management, environment of care, patient safety, all of those different factors as a means to drive performance going forward. Again, it's leveraging all of these different linkages between the different reporting entities, those departments, to overall drive change as we continue to go forward. And again, showing the reporting of this information all the way up to the executive management committee, whether it's a CEO, CFO, CNO, or whatever we have in place as an organization, all the way up to the board of directors or governors at the accountability level. But again, showing all of those linkages, the benchmarking, the target setting, this is done between each of the different departments. Now, what I also want to emphasize too is as we continue to look at things going forward, we would identify certain factors that we want to establish from an overall process improvement, performance improvement perspective, really at that top level. And what I would quantify these as is really our organizational goals from a performance improvement perspective looking forward. This is not to say that each individual department cannot have certain performance improvement initiatives that they maybe want to focus on top of the larger organizational goals. What it's really saying is that when we establish these organizational goals, we want to establish them in a perspective that the entire organization has bought into those goals and continues to focus on them moving forward. So again, looking at it as truly a systems-based approach as opposed to just certain segmented parts of the hospital looking forward. Now, when we look at those reporting entity responsibilities, those reporting entities are really responsible for setting indicator selection, target setting, benchmarking, and action planning. And really what it focuses on is it looks at those different factors as a means to really drive some of those outcomes. Now, if we are focusing on something, say we want to improve our claims conversion, that's something that we would push down to the business office. And what we would have that department do is continue to report back on those process improvement initiatives. But what we wouldn't do is get the entire performance improvement executive committee focusing on a monthly basis as to how we're actually approving those areas. Again, we would drive the overall goal at that higher level, but then we would segment out through the use of task force groups to actually drive certain initiatives going forward. Now, when we look at the flow of data, everything flows in and out of that PIEC. It's really the keeper of that overall data. So again, our reporting entities will leverage data and submit metrics and that information back to the PIEC. The PIEC will report information to management and government committees. Again, it's looking at that as a means to ensure that, one, we're leveraging all of the available data within the organization, but continuing to leverage that data to improve outcomes going forward. Oftentimes, again, what we end up seeing is that organizations will not leverage the available data that they have, and they will think that they're improving in performance perspective. But when we actually get at that granular level of looking at the data, we actually find that the organization is going in the opposite direction. So again, leverage all of that data that we have. It's one of our most valuable resources in the organization. And for those of us that are in ACOs or looking at other population-based outcomes, Data will continue to grow relative to importance for the services that we actually provide. So we want to start creating those resources to leverage that data as we start to move forward. Now, one of the things that I like the most about the PIEC is that every department is not reporting to the PIEC every single month. And oftentimes what we end up seeing is that when we create that environment where every committee or every department is reporting every month, we end up creating a monotonous environment where people tend to say the things over and over and over again. And things become stale within an organization because we're hearing the same information on a recurring basis. So by changing the sequencing and having individuals only focus on their certain initiatives, either every third month or every other month, it allows us to drill down into specific areas and have more comprehensive conversations around a specific outcome or measure, as opposed to going around a room and everybody just having a few minutes to give a high-level review of their department. So again, it allows us to tackle those more granular issues or derive the impact of those issues on the overall performance and direction of the hospital. And then quarterly, also relating back those certain initiatives to the overall strategic plan and organizational wide priorities for the hospital or the entity. Now, when we look at these different areas within the hospital, one thing that this does is it leverages task force development groups. And what task force groups are specific mission-driven or purpose-driven collectives of individuals that will come together for a finite period of time to focus on one specific initiative. A key factor of this is once they have reached resolution or resolved the issue, that group disbands until that group is either needed to be called again or we're pulling in some other group of people. But again, we're establishing a group of people based on the specific need for that organization and driving that as a go-forward basis. What we're not doing is creating an environment where we establish a group and then that group ends up becoming another committee at the hospital that meets either semi-monthly or monthly with really no stated purpose, but they continue to get together just because it's a recurring meeting. I would say that this is one of the biggest advantages of the PIEC is really leveraging those task force groups to focus on those specific initiatives as we go forward. And the last slide is, again, really focusing on the prioritization matrix. Again, ranking those different things within the organization. Now, what I want to emphasize also is once we've established things, they're not stagnant as we continue to look forward. Something that is of lower importance today could be of higher importance tomorrow. So it requires the continual evaluation of those things that are actually established as performance improvement initiatives, realizing that we may add future things or take things off of those initiatives based on how the hospital is performing going forward. Realize that this is really a living document from a performance improvement perspective, and use that as a means to drive the overall hospital performance. So to really sum things up, again, it's looking at from the perspective, again, of how do we bring together quality and finance, realizing that there could not be more different from one another. One is really reporting on information, whereas the other is the providing and delivery of care, but breaking down those silos from the perspective to realize we need to create an environment where those two groups realize that they're integrated together and that ultimately to improve the performance of a hospital going forward, we need to break down those silos and start to leverage the linkages of those different departments and create efficiencies across the hospital. So I know I've thrown a ton of information at everybody. And again, the purpose was to discuss this at a high enough level to see the broader themes, but to get granular in certain areas so that we can start to have some conversation around the different components. The organizations that we've seen that have actually implemented this strategy have continued to see year over year performance and process improvement at the organization, and also the creation of efficiencies within the organization due to the increased leveraging of staff across the organization, and realizing that because we all have a finite amount of time, we need to work to actually leverage our colleagues and coworkers so that we can continue to improve the hospital as a whole. So what I want to do now is open it up to see if there's different questions around the information or different topics. So I'll end up unmuting everybody, or people can unmute themselves, or we can type in the chat box, and we can go from there.